Hello, everyone. Good afternoon in Hawaii. Welcome to Looking to the East. Thank you very much for listening into our show or watching our show. A very interesting subject that we're going to cover today. Those of you that pay attention to the news 2 weeks ago, there were several articles all across the world, no matter where you look, reporting on Japan's decision to dump wastewater, toxic water, from the nuclear facility in Fukushima directly into the Pacific Ocean. Needless to say, this is very controversial, and there are a lot of questions around it. Maybe the biggest question is, why are they doing this? So we have a very special guest with us today, a long-term journalist in Japan who's reported specifically on this issue. He's interviewed me a couple of times on university-related activity, and now we've turned the tables. I'm going to be interviewing him on this subject. So I'd like to welcome Michael Penn to the show. Michael, thank you so much for participating early in the morning here in Japan, and especially during Golden Week. Right? We're in the middle of a holiday season here in Japan, so I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. There's no rest for the wicked. The news never sleeps, so it's not a problem for me.
Okay, thank you. So Michael is the publisher editor of Shingetsu News. That's his primary position, but he also writes articles and does interviews with various media sources around the world. So, Michael, let's just jump into this. You reported on this a couple of weeks ago. I saw some interviews. You were called on. This is a huge story, not necessarily a very positive one for Japan. But for those viewers who maybe don't understand the context of this, you were in Japan, as I was, 10 years ago, when a massive tsunami hit the upper coast of Japan, the Honshu Island, and unfortunately flooded a nuclear facility. Maybe just briefly, you can give our viewers a background on what happened back in March, 10 years ago.
Okay, well, basically, some people will know this very well, and other people may not remember it or maybe less familiar with it. On March, the afternoon local time on March 11th of 2011, there was a massive earthquake off the coast of northern Japan. It was measured a 9.0 earthquake, and even here in Tokyo, where I was, it was felt very, very strongly. Buildings shaking, telephone poles shaking. It was very nasty business. Now, the earthquake itself was bad enough, but it also produced a huge tsunami. A giant wave of water flooded onto the coastline throughout the Tohoku region, or the northern region of Japan, and ended up killing well over, I think, 15, 16,000 people. It was a massive tragedy. And then there was a third element to the Great Crisis, and that was that not only was there a major earthquake and a tsunami, but it also ended up flooding this nuclear plant, which was on the coastline, called the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, and it ended up creating a triple meltdown, meaning that three of the six reactors that were at the plant went into meltdown, and a few days later they exploded, and radiation was basically poured into the seas and into the land, and hundreds of thousands of people had to leave their homes and to evacuate. And briefly, there was worried that there would be this giant radioactive cloud that might even come over Tokyo. The prime minister at that time, whose name was Naoto Kan, relates that there was a 24, 48-hour period where he was actually considering asking the 35 million people of Tokyo region to evacuate. It would be, a near destruction of the entire nation. So it was an extraordinarily dramatic time. And for any of us who lived here, we all remember it very clearly.
Yeah, there was a mass exodus of foreigners from Japan during this period of time. Even in the area where I live, Michael lives in the Tokyo area. I live in the Osaka area, which is another 500 kilometers away from Tokyo. And there was great concern that the Japanese government was not handling this disaster properly or effectively, and that, as Michael was saying, it could get a lot worse. Um, at the time, TEPCO, which is the name of the company that manages this nuclear facility, was not all that forthcoming about the amount of damage that occurred to the nuclear facility. So there was a lot of confusing information. And I mentioned this because we can now fast forward 10 years and how the general population in Japan and how I feel about what's happening now. So, and how whether or not we can believe it, what's being told or what's being stated as the causes for doing this and the safety of doing this and so forth. So let's jump ahead 10 years now to Japan's decision. And this has not been something they've done quickly, Michael. I think they've been talking, investigating this, thinking about this for years. And finally, the Prime Minister, Suga, of Japan made an announcement that, yes, indeed, Japan will take this wastewater that's been collecting over the last 10 years in various storage facilities, will begin to, and to be clear, it's not now, it'll be 2 years from now, is what I read was the plan. Michael, please correct me if that's not right. Will begin to be dumped directly into the Pacific Ocean after being treated. So I read it's 1 million tons of wastewater, and that means nothing to me. So I did a little research last night to try and figure out what that means in gallons. It's roughly 264 million gallons of wastewater. Uh, One article I read, Michael, you may have been involved in this one, said it was 500 Olympic-sized pools of water. And I did a calculation too. It's 4 billion glasses. So maybe our viewers can relate to a glass of water because that's something that they drink every day. So it's 4 billion of those. Michael, do you have anything to add about how this was reported a couple of weeks ago, or any other details that I overlooked?
Well, obviously, there's many details, and the first thing that should be said is that I'm a journalist and not a scientist, so I cannot speak with the authority of somebody who is somebody who studies radioactivity. But what I do is I talk to the people who do these studies. I've interviewed the scientists who are considered some of the best experts on this, and so what you can get from me is kind of from real experts, but kind of filtered through my own layman's understanding.
All
Uh,
right.
but that said, so yes, basically, this water that is in question here is essentially water that was used to cool the reactors that had melted down. So, in order to keep them from creating an even larger disaster. So they basically, a lot of them were pumped through the areas right near the heart of the radioactive disaster. Then after that, they were filtered through a system which the Japanese government calls ALPS. And
Mhm.
the purpose of the ALPS filtration system is to try to get rid of the most dangerous of the radioactive particles, isotopes, and to essentially leave it with only one major isotope left, which is called tritium. And tritium, while it is a radioactive isotope, it's considered to be one of the least dangerous to human health. And so, what the Japanese government is claiming, and we can interrogate this a bit if you would like.
Oh,
Uh, what,
absolutely.
the, what the government is claiming is that the water in the tank, which has been filtered through this ALF system, will be radioactive, yes, but it'll be radioactive only with tritium, and that by putting this by dumping this water into the Pacific Ocean, there's basically a near zero threat to anyone's human health, and that's essentially what their argument is.
Yeah, so this gets back to the point that I was mentioning earlier about the government's credibility. So I remember 10 years ago, and even before then, the nuclear industry in Japan is strongly supported by the prevailing political party, which basically has run Japan since World War II, the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party. And there was something called a nuclear, was it nuclear village, Michael? Or nuclear, the collaboration between
That's right.
academia, yeah, remember this? Academia, industry, and then also government. And so they
And
kind of
media.
all, and
And the
media.
media.
Oh, okay. So there were four elements. So they all kind of, at least from my perspective, conspire to promote nuclear energy. Japan, we have to be clear, has no internal energy resources, has no oil, is completely dependent on either outside sources or, in this case, nuclear to feed its energy requirements.
Well, if I can stop
But
you right there,
okay,
that's no longer as true as it used to be because there is sunshine in Japan and there is wind in Japan and there is geothermal in Japan. So there are rivers in Japan, which there can be dams, things like this. So while it's
okay,
true there's no oil and gas and sort of the fossil fuels, which or at least very little, uh, there may be a little bit off the coast of Akita, but basically yes, Japan is considered to be an energy poor nation, but this that reputation could change with the advance of renewable energies.
okay. Well, let's hope so. But it, there's a very clear association, collaboration between these four elements that we just talked about to promote nuclear energy. And from my perspective, you're probably much more better informed about this. A lot of what they said in terms of the safety of nuclear energy, the cost of nuclear energy, specifically how the disaster was handled 10 years ago, as we talked about, TEPCO did not admit easily. I took weeks, I think, before they admitted that there was actually a meltdown there. So, given that context, various parts of the world, like Korea and China, the farmers and the fishermen in the area, there's been a wide range of responses to this government announcement. The United States, by the way, seemed to be vaguely supportive of this. That our Secretary of State Blinken, I believe his name is, said that it's good that Japan is so transparent about what they're doing, which is that kind of blows my mind because Japan hasn't been transparent about this over the years. But a wide range of responses within the context of how, at least from my perspective, little credibility TEPCO or the Jiminto, the government has on this. How do we make sense of this? Who can we believe? So maybe you could address the experts that you talked to, Michael, to try and give us some insight as to is this really safe or not? Because there's opinions that are so wide ranging on this.
Yeah, well, there's an awful lot in what you just said there to try to unpack. Um, so first of all, you have to understand that everybody has their own interests from depending on what standpoint they're coming at things at. So in terms of the reactions to the announcement that this water would be released into the Pacific Ocean, I guess you can say there are three major camps. Those that have said they understand and support the decision, which is the U.S. government position, probably mainly because they just want to be supportive of their allies, and also because behind the scenes, something's probably not very well known and has not been well reported, is that the U.S. the government and Japan have a lot of links in the nuclear industry, and it was probably, from what I've heard from some sources, that the U.S. government had told Japan not to abandon nuclear power after Fukushima. So
Wow.
there's a lot more going on there than maybe we even know. Um, and then there's the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Association, which has also been supportive of Japan's position. And one key thing we might want to revisit if we have time is that the IAEA will be involved apparently in monitoring and working with the Japanese on the water releases, which is something that's a positive thing. But on the other hand, the IAEA seems to be, have something of a pro-nuclear agenda uh, of its own.
Mhm.
Um, so then you have the group of people, I guess you could say the farmers and the fishermen in the Fukushima area, and their main concern, I mean, I don't know if they really fear whether or not the radiation is dangerous, but they do know that it's dangerous to their business. They do know that the reputational damage is severe, and there's all these boycotts internationally on Fukushima food, and they're essentially like, we've already suffered for a decade, not able to do our business, and now you're just making it worse by making this announcement. So in their case, it's about business and about reputation. And then you have other people who are some ordinary citizens. Then you have, the South Koreans and the Chinese who fear that there is a serious health threat that will come from this water releases. In the cases of the Chinese and South Korean, there's also a little bit of a chance to poke the Japanese government in the eye because they have their own disputes and other problems with the Japanese government, and any chance to kind of catch them out when Japan's not looking good, they'll take advantage of it. But at the same time, there's also a whole lot of people who are just really really afraid of radioactivity. It doesn't have a good reputation. People really worry about getting cancer or other diseases that can come from radioactivity for good reason. Uh,
Mhm.
then we come to the question of, okay, is it really dangerous? And this dangerous ground to trod, because essentially anything you have to say about it is going to make one group of people very very angry, and think that you're either
Michael, I'm okay with that as long as it's the right people that we're making angry.
well, I know. Well, here's the thing. You know, if you say there's a serious health threat, you're going to get accused of fear mongering, and
I
if you say
see.
no health threat, then people are going to call you naive and say that you're endangering public health. And it is a highly politicized issue. All of that said, I didn't become a journalist because I'm a coward. I became a journalist because I try to figure out the truth and to speak it as clearly as I can. Um, as far as I've been able to determine from talking to people who do seem to be serious experts who are only looking to tell the truth, if what is released into the ocean is just the tritium that the Japanese government says it is, then basically there probably isn't much to be concerned about. Tritium is already released into the seas by every nuclear power plant around the world. There's already tritium releases all over the place. Yeah,
Mhm.
you may remember that in the 1950s and 60s, there were giant nuclear weapons tests on Pacific Islands, and all of that put radiation into the seas as well. So even though this volume of water is so great, we're not talking about some massive spike in radioactivity in the Pacific Ocean. That it's not of that kind of level because we already have this in our environment, frankly.
Mhm.
Um, but the area where there could be some concern and legitimate concern is that in those tanks, not all of the radioactive isotopes are tritium. There are more dangerous isotopes which have not been completely filtered out by the ALPS system. So to kind of get to the bottom line, if what is released is truly filters out these more dangerous isotopes, and if there is a monitoring system that has credibility and doesn't rely on just trust me kind of politics, where different parties with different interests can be involved and can verify what's in the tanks and what's being released, then this shouldn't be such a huge issue. But if it's just a matter of the Japanese government and TEPCO and maybe the IAEA saying, yeah, don't worry about it. We know, we got this under control. We got it handled. Just don't worry about it. Then there's a bit of a problem. So essentially, I think for me, the core issue is get multiple parties involved and get verification that what's being dumped is what they say is being dumped.
Yeah, that is one of the questions I wanted to ask you. I read the response from the IAEA, and I don't know much about them, but they did seem to be supportive of the new. It reminds me of the collusion that occurs between industry and regulation, and we see this in Japan clearly, in the construction industry, for example, in America too. So I just didn't get a sense of credibility from them. At the same time, the United Nations, which also looks at these types of things, is saying something quite different. That this is concerning and could be a health threat to the world. So you have another agency looking at the same issue and coming up with different conclusions.
Yeah,
But
and on that
I think
point, I mean, the IAEA, I think, is actually UN affiliated, but then the human rights, I believe it was
yes,
section of the UN spoke against. So you had two parts of the UN taking opposite positions, which was very interesting. But
exactly.
one thing to be noted is that there is a news story that came out that said that the IAEA may invite, for example, Chinese nuclear experts to be part of the mission, and that would be a very positive step if they do so.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have high expectations here, Michael. I don't know if you share them or not, but I think you're right. If they did do that, then this would, I think the public response would be much more muted. But let's look at why they actually decided to do this. Despite all of these issues and how it's going to be handled going forward, this was a black eye for Japan for sure. And it, like you were saying, with the farmers and the fishermen in that area, even if there is no real credible threat to the wastewater that's being dumped, the perception is that there is. And Japanese consumers, being very health conscious, are not going to buy things from Fukushima. So you have the government trying to rebuild Fukushima and rebrand Fukushima. They even tie it into the Olympics. Kind of, I know it's not very effective, but that's a part of their marketing campaign. But on the other hand, they announced that we're going to start dumping wastewater from nuclear facilities directly into the ocean. So why did they do this, do you think? Is it Greenpeace was saying it was strictly because of cost, because it's cheaper to dump the water than to store it or to get rid of it some other way?
Well, at that point, I think Greenpeace is probably right. Greenpeace, by the way, they're the ones who are probably on sort of the far end of the spectrum of those who say that there is a human health threat. Their experts essentially say that it is dangerous. Even the tritium, they say, we can't be sure that it's safe, which is true. I mean, there's no evidence that the tritium releases would be safe, but but their position is essentially any human health threat is too much.
Mm.
Um, and so, yes, it's the options apparently. I mean, the main options would have been two. One is to essentially start dumping the water, which, as you correctly said earlier on, is something that probably won't actually happen for another couple of years. Um, and then the other one is to continue to build more storage tanks and more and more and more, which probably was a viable option. I mean, you just need to find more space somewhere and to put more water in it. And then, take decades and decades of keeping that water there. But of course, that also has its risks because, who
Good
knows if
leak.
some earthquake or some other, disaster comes along and could create problems, still the water could still flow out somewhere. But so those are basically it. And yes, when Greenpeace says that cost was probably the deciding factor, I think that's probably right.
Okay.
The financial damage from the Fukushima disaster has been enormous, and and the Japanese government probably said, well, look, if we release this tritium water into the ocean, it's basically no threat as far as we can understand, and it's a lot cheaper. So let's go with that. I think that's probably what their thinking is on this matter.
So, in the case of Chernobyl, as I recall, the Russians just dumped concrete into everything and completely just covered it up and shut it down. Why didn't Japan consider that as an option to just write it off and say no one can live here for 10,000 years? I don't quite understand. Are they trying to recover these nuclear facilities? Is this a longer term strategy to try and make these nuclear facilities viable again in the future?
Well, the Fukushima Daiichi plant is done, and
Okay,
everybody knows that. I think that the situation may have been a little bit different because in the case of Chernobyl, you had a nuclear reactor which actually exploded, and bent pieces all of itself all over the place. In the case of the Japanese, even though we saw those explosions, that was apparently mostly just, I guess, air of some kind that exploded the buildings. But the reactors themselves, they melted down, but they didn't explode, and
I
so they
see.
kind of melted down into things. So essentially, there was a moment in the first week of the crisis when the Prime Minister Khan, faced this decision, and TEPCO faced this decision whether or not to pull staff from the reactor and to basically give up on it and just let it go. But they decided to stay in there and to try to cool the reactors. And from what I understand, uh, you know, uh, the Fukushima disaster we talk about, as bad as it was, could have been about 10 times worse because if the decision had been taken that it was a total loss and they pulled out the staff and everything there melted down, including reactor number 4, that we wouldn't be talking about Fukushima as the second worst nuclear disaster of all time. We'd be talking about it probably as the worst of all time.
Prime Minister Khan doesn't get credit for that. He's kind of considered to have failed when it came to handling this crisis, but that's a very, very good point. We only have a couple minutes left, Michael. I wanted to talk briefly about the costs. So I was listening to the news. Sometimes when I'm up in Tokyo in a hotel, I listen to the BBC, and there was a nuclear media guy talking about Fukushima, and he was saying, well, it wasn't that bad because only one person died. That was his covering statement regarding Fukushima and how safe nuclear power really is. But the fact is, the costs and recovery of this, I've seen the estimates from the government, 200 billion, 300 billion. It's going up every time they report it. And some other independent analysis that I read puts it at 1 trillion. Recovery from this nuclear disaster is going to cost Japan $1 trillion. Is that
I don't
correct?
have any. I don't have insights on what the final figure will be. Like yourself, when I start seeing those big numbers, my eyes start getting a little glassy. But but what I can say is that those people who say that there were no victims or only one victim, they're kind of only looking at a very narrow thing. If you're talking about people who were physically killed by radiation or explosions, that might be right, but might be right. We don't know for certain, and we don't know
Mhm.
what's going to happen 10 years from now or 15 years from now as possible cancer rates. People might get cancer who didn't otherwise wouldn't have got it. But if you uproot hundreds of thousands of people from their homes, mostly elderly people, and send them into evacuation centers, there were clearly dozens, maybe hundreds of people who died who wouldn't have otherwise have died. And they're
Right.
victims of Fukushima. It's not simply, what happens from the radiation. It's also about disrupting people's lives, putting them in evacuation centers, the movement and transfer of massive populations. People die during those things. And those people must be considered victims of the Fukushima nuclear disaster.
Right. All right. Well, Michael, we've run out of time. This went by so quickly. Thank you so much for sharing your insights on this very controversial issue. I'm sure the story will continue over the next couple of years or so, and perhaps I can have you back on and we can revisit this. And I hope in the end we did make the right people angry with this show. I
Well, it's always a pleasure, Steve. And I'm a journalist, so anytime you need me, I'm around.
Thank you so much. All right, everyone. I'll be doing a show in a couple of weeks on venture capital in Japan. I'll be promoting that one. So mark that on your calendars 2 weeks from today. I'll be interviewing a venture capitalist who's quite successful here in Japan. Thank you again, Michael, and thank you to our viewers and those of you on YouTube who watch this later. We're out for now. The wrap.